All right, it looks like we have a quorum present. The PRB meeting will come to order. Ashley, can you take attendance of the board?
Josh McGee,
Here.
Keith Brainerd,
Here.
Andrew Cable, Stephanie Leiby, Robert Massagill,
Here.
Robert May,
Here.
Ernest Richards.
Present.
All right, so we're going to move on to item number 3 on our agenda, the approval of the August 11th, 2017 board minutes. The chair entertains a motion to suspend the reading of the minutes.
So moved.
The motion has been made and seconded to suspend the reading of the minutes. Is there any discussion from the board or correction to the minutes, which are included in your binder? Hearing none, motion has been made and seconded to suspend the reading of the minutes. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the minutes will not be read. The minutes are approved as circulated. All right, we also need to excuse the absence of Judge Cable from our last board meeting, so the chair entertains a motion to excuse Judge Cable from the August 11th, 2017 board meeting.
Second.
Motion has been made and seconded to excuse Judge Cable from the August 11th, 2017 board meeting. Is there any board discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. The ayes have it. Judge Cable is excused from the August 11th, 2017 board meeting.
I was in baby judge school.
All right, so getting to more of the meat of our agenda, we're going to start off with recognition of staff for development of the MET program. Judge Cable, can you handle this portion?
Michelle, I'll stand up here and there's a resolution that we'd like to read, but by looks at the faces in this crowd, y'all have been coming here a lot longer than I've been on this board, and obviously a lot of times the legislature will hand down, sorry, a lot of times the legislature will hand down tasks for us to do, and they've given us a monumental one this time, and our staff here at the board has been running as a deficit for many, many years. And Michelle grabbed a hold of this and made us all look very good. Sorry, that's the state representative, I don't know, I'll put him on hold. Sorry guys, maybe I should take that. But give me a shot at this with my glasses on and off, but I'd like to read this to you. Whereas Michelle Cranes and her team spent a tremendous amount of time and energy from 2013 to 2017 creating the Pension Review Board's minimal education training program for public pension trustees and administrators. Whereas Ms. Cranes responded to the mandate by the legislature and, in short measure, initiated and created workable education program from scratch and balanced the different priorities and stakeholders to make the program successful. Whereas Ms. Cranes considered the program's direction with a critical eye that looked at how decisions made during its development would affect the future needs of the program's participants. Whereas Ms. Cranes delivered creative solutions to unforeseen obstacles and served as a sounding board for the program. Whereas Ms. Cranes also acted as a motivating leader, meeting program milestones to develop the rules for accreditation and compliance, tracking and delivery of the original online courses in public pension fundamentals on a time within certain resources and constraints. Whereas Ms. Cranes and her team put forth a program that set forth meaningful standards for public pension trustee education without being unduly burdensome. Whereas Ms. Cranes and her team's efforts produced the MET program, which resulted in close to 1,000 course completions within the first year, which was incredible. Whereas Ms. Cranes and her team established the accreditation process for organizations offering qualified training, which already includes that of 13 accredited MET sponsors, and whereas Ms. Cranes and her team successfully reported the compliance of the public pension trustees and administrators in meeting the MET requirements of the legislator and governor beginning in 2016 now, therefore be it resolved on the 16th day of November 2017 that the Pension Review Board for the Texas hereby commend, recognize, and thank Ms. Michelle Cranes for her invaluable contribution to the MET program and to this agency. Thank you very much. Thank you for making all of us look so great and smart.
Anu, can you get up, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
No. Oh, we're not ready.
Oh, he's
That
taking
was for Anu.
Okay.
1, 2. 3. Thank you.
Should we do a selfie with her? Thank you.
I'm elected, I'll take a picture.
Thank you, Ms. Cranes, and thank you, Judge Cable. Sounded like she did quite a lot in that nice, long...
She has done well.
All right, so moving on to the Actuarial Committee agenda item. Mr. May, can you kick us off here?
Sure, discussing and considering the following matters, and A is, I'll look to Anu to discuss the tab 2A information.
Thank you, Bob. Members, at the October 13th meeting of the Actuarial Committee, the committee members received an update from the City of Fort Worth and the Fort Worth Retirement Fund regarding the progress they have made on the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan. The city was represented by the city manager, Mr. David Cook, and the assistant city manager, Susan Alanis, and the fund was represented by its executive director, Joel Mevy. The committee and the city and fund representatives had a good discussion. The city manager, Mr. Cook, provided some background on the benefit changes or prospective benefit reductions that the city has made over the last decade to stave off some of the funding challenges that the retirement fund is facing. He also outlined some of the steps that the City Council has taken since then. 2 years ago, the city manager appointed a pension task force, which includes the employee association members, the city's financial advisor, a citizen member, and the executive director of the pension plan on the task force. The task force is looking at different options of making plan changes, benefit changes, as well as contribution increases to address the funding challenges of the plan. The city also hired a consulting firm, the PFM Group, to run some scenario analysis of making benefit changes, including moving future employees into TMRS, making additional benefit reductions for employees, as well as contribution increases. The City Council, as well as the Pension Board, met in a joint session 2 days ago, and the consulting firm provided its projection on when the fund is expected to run out of money, and they said that, and this is, we haven't contacted the city or the fund yet, and this is based on one of the news articles that we came across. Both the consulting firm as well as the plan's actuary stated that the fund could potentially run out of money anywhere from in the next 20 to 30 years. On November 21st, the task force is going to start considering some of the recommendations that the consulting firm will provide to the task force to review. Mr. Cook also informed the committee that the City Council has already identified additional benefit reductions that they have informed the fund of, and that they expect to provide an update on the progress of the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan as far as putting the pension fund on notice, which is a requirement in their city charter regarding these benefit changes, as well as the progress on the plan members voting on their contribution increases sometime in January. And based on the news article, it appears that they expect to approve these benefit changes as well as contribution changes sometime in April of next year. We will make sure to reach out to the city as well as the fund to stay on top of the changes they're reviewing and any actions they are contemplating, and update the members at the next meeting. And we have included in your meeting packet behind tab 2A the information that was provided by the city as well as the pension fund at the October committee meeting. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions?
Do you anticipate it'll be necessary for them to come back in and update us personally, either at the full board meeting or at a committee meeting?
We could consider that once they have made a decision on the recommended changes, the members could consider inviting the city as well as the plan to walk the board through the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan that they end up adopting next year.
Is the PRB offering any assistance to help them as they kind of decide on what the FSRP is going to be?
Thank you. At the committee meeting, the members did offer to provide technical assistance and provide recommendations if the city and the fund requested. They haven't reached out to us for any specific technical assistance yet, but we'll make sure we reiterate that we'd be happy to review or help in any way we can.
Do we know why they're having problems?
The city did provide some information on that, and they have been, of course, like all of our other retirement systems, impacted by the 2008-2009 financial downturn. I think back in 2005-2006, the fund also dealt with some salary spiking issues, and they mentioned that the investment performance of the pension plan has not been at par, and there has been a contribution shortfall on the part of the city as well, which has contributed to their current funding challenges. They also made some specific cost of living adjustment changes a couple of years ago when they reduced benefits prospectively. Those COLAs were expensive, and that did play a role in their unfunded liability as well.
Just to add to that, on my kind of look at the plan and just from the information we've received, I think it's probably safe to say that they adopted funding policy elements that would not abide by our guidelines. There were lots of elements that over time that they had adopted that would not kind of fit our guidelines for appropriate plan funding. So I think there were things the plan did, things the city did. There were kind of, both were at fault, and then of course the investment underperformance.
Tony, were there any issues related to the drop plan that they mentioned were a problem?
Sure. So the Fort Worth Retirement Fund does have a drop program. However, relatively speaking, their drop plan is cost neutral. They do not provide any interest credit. They made those changes to the drop program a couple of years ago, but there's no interest credit in the drop program. It has a limited time, or I think it's limited to 5 years when the members would then have to leave the drop, and they do not have post-retirement drop option either. So. But they are looking at additional drop-related changes as well.
Next, for the item 4 actuarial committee, is item 4B. and I'm going to reach out to Kenny to discuss this.
Good afternoon, good morning, members. Sorry. So at the October committee meeting, staff presented some metrics to take into account when deciding what plans to give a more intensive look. So if I can direct you to tab B. As you probably know, one of our mandates is to provide an intensive study of pension plans or our systems in order to identify potential or existing problems. Through history, we've not had maybe a formal process or a structured process, and so part of the purpose is to provide kind of a more structured aspect and a little more information and transparency to the types of metrics we are looking at when we're starting to decide or maybe prioritizing which plans we want to look at first. So the staff came up with 9 different metrics that we thought would be useful to consider kind of as a snapshot and a quick view. Obviously we would look more in depth as we delved closer, decided on the plans, but this is intended to provide kind of a quick idea of what we're looking at. And so we presented these 9 metrics at the October committee meeting. There was a bit of discussion about these specific metrics, whether they should be included or not. If you look at the bottom of page 1 and the top of page 2, it lists those 9 metrics. One of the 9 we have not included on the next page, which is a list of all of the metrics, all of the plans and all of their metrics, and that was change in discount rate. So that one was more of I guess a note. It wasn't a specific metric. And so on the spreadsheet or the sheet following the blue piece of paper behind tab B is a list of all plans organized by amortization period, similar to our AV report. And then it shows all of the metrics that we have started to look at. So I will say that this is a start. This is definitely not a final product. This is something that is going to be an ongoing change or ongoing process as we develop and organize how we are actually doing this. So the 8 metrics that are included in this: amortization period, funded ratio, unfunded accrued liability as a percentage of payroll are all fairly well-known metrics that we include in our actuarial evaluation report. We've also included discount rate. Payroll growth rate is something that can certainly impact the calculated amortization period because it's taken into account when we're trying to determine the expected funding period. We've also included actual contribution as a percentage of ADC, so this is something that we now include in our contribution report, and it kind of gives a view of how much the plans are contributing in accordance with what the pension funding guidelines now say is the maximum amortization period. So the ADC is the actual determined contribution, and this is the required contribution that's required to be reported by plans. And I can't remember the statute off the top of my head, but it's one of the legislative mandates, I think, that was put in place in 2015. We also include drop as a percentage of funded net fiduciary net position, that is kind of a measure of potential liquidity concerns. If it gets too high, as we saw with the Dallas Police and Fire is a good example, and there are, if something pops up and a large number of people decide to pull their money out, it could result in some potential liquidity concerns. And then non-investment cash flow as a percentage of fiduciary net position is a similar measure. It takes a look at the potential for a plan to have to sell assets in order to pay their benefit payments, and so that could impact long-term rates of return if they're having to sell assets at a loss in order to pay benefits. So those are the items that we've kind of taken a look at. And if you look at the very last page, there is a key to kind of explain the color coding. Amortization period and discount rate is the exact same color coding we use in our AV report right now. We've also added in some steps for funded ratios based on how poorly funded you are. So less than 40 is the darkest, and we kind of picked some, I'll say, somewhat arbitrary measures and chosen 20% breaks in order to identify those. The others are highlighting the worst quartile of almost all the others, excuse me, are highlighting the worst quartile of the group. So it's not a fine, bright line of this is, a specific measure that is at an issue. It is simply these are the 25% worst plans when compared to all the other plans in Texas. And then the drop as a percentage of FMP, where we are highlighting anybody that has 15% or more.
Do you have anything else on item 4B? Before we go to the next item?
No, I do want to point out that the purpose of starting this is we are starting to do actual intensive studies. We have highlighted or identified 3 plans that we're going to start with. Those are Greenville Fire, Marshall Fire, and Galveston Employees Plan for Police. And so our expectation is to have a draft of those reviews ready for the January actuarial committee meeting, and then we'll bring any additional information to following board meetings once we get through with those. Let's see here. I don't think I have anything else specific, unless you all have questions about the process.
I got a good question. Actually, this is a good start. On page number 2, item number 7, is that supposed to be forward drop or funded drop on your metrics?
And I believe it's supposed to be forward drop.
Forward drop, okay.
There are 2 different types of deferred retirement option plans. One is a forward drop where you elect to retire on paper at some point prior to your actual retirement date, and then you start taking your benefit is put into the fund on your behalf, and you no longer accrue additional service even though you're continuing to work. A reverse drop would be at your actual retirement date. You act as if you retired in the past.
Thank you. And is there any particular order? Is there rank ordering? Is it just...
No, there is no rank ordering. It's simply these are the factors that we're looking at to kind of give us a more holistic view of the plan, and so we're not just focusing on amortization period. Amortization period is certainly an important factor.
Yeah.
But it's just one of many, and so we wanted to make it apparent that we are looking at a number of factors when we're trying to decide, when we're looking at financial health of the plan.
One last question. So when you're comparing, are you comparing in isolation, standalone, or you're comparing in relation to other funds?
We are comparing in relationship to all the funds, so we're kind of taking a look at how they stand on each metric compared to other plans,
right.
But then also how all of those kind of come together in order to identify which plan we want to prioritize and look at first.
Good job. Thank you, guys. Good.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question? Okay, could you please explain why payroll growth rate is in here and what difference it makes?
Certainly. Give me 1 second. So payroll growth rate is, the discount rate and the payroll growth rate are both used to calculate the effective interest rate, which is used to determine the amortization period. So the amortization period is how long you expect to take the plan to be funded. And the reason the payroll growth rate is important is because typically in a percent of pay plan, the contribution is expected to increase at the payroll growth rate going forward. So it's not a flat dollar amount every year. It is a percentage of pay that increases as the payroll growth rate increases. So the larger that number is, all else being equal, the smaller the amortization period is going to be. So it's more of a potential red flag. We're not saying that any of these are incorrect or even unreasonable for a particular plan, but it is one that can be used to change the amortization period depending on why you're selecting where in the range is reasonable.
And if the actual experience, just to quickly add, does not match the assumed payroll growth, then the fund would face potential contribution shortfall in that regard.
Yeah, can I extend that just a little bit? So I think there are kind of two concerns here. As you said, if the amortization schedule is percent of pay, then it's explicitly building in the payroll growth into their amortization schedule. And so if payroll growth is not as steep, then it's going to underperform on contributions. I think another thing for consideration, especially with as many fixed rate plans as we have, is the fixed rate in the implied amortization schedule builds in the payroll growth assumption. Right? And so if payroll growth, it's implicitly built into the amortization there, amortization period for our fixed rate plans as well. So it's affecting a lot of plans in Texas on the amortization number. So if there's a high amortization or a high payroll growth rate assumption, then that just means they're expecting to pay a whole lot more in the future because payroll is going to grow faster. So in some ways, it kind of pushes some of that cost out into the future with the assumption that the budget's going to grow because payroll is growing.
And what happens if payroll does not grow at the assumed rate?
Contributions will fall short, or contributions will grow faster relative to budget than they were anticipated.
So I noticed that almost every plan with a payroll growth rate that's shaded in orange, that is apparently 4% and higher, is a Telfer plan.
It's not something that I had identified, so I couldn't speak if that's true or not.
All right. That's all I have. Thank you.
Is the implication of that maybe that we should look at kind of common practices across types of plans?
Well, I don't have any implication, only that there seems to be a close correlation between payroll growth rate, Telfer plans, and presence near the top of this chart. And the top of this chart is plans with the longest amortization period. All else equal, the plans that are potentially in the biggest trouble. And so there may be a strong relationship between the payroll growth assumption and the condition of the plan.
I think that's an interesting observation. I think you actually made a really important point in that, not that I'm surprised that you made an important point. You made an important point in that there seems to be a correlation with long amortization periods plus high payroll growth assumptions. High payroll growth assumption doesn't necessarily mean that you are overstating payroll growth, but it does mean you're probably more likely payroll's more likely to fall short of that assumption, meaning that the amortization period is likely understated. So even though they're high, some of them are likely understated. So there's kind of a reinforcing element there.
For state and local governments over the past 6 years or so, payroll's been growing about 2%. So a plan with a payroll growth assumption of 4 or 5% they may be anticipating a rate of payroll growth or new employment growth that is substantially higher than what most people are actually experiencing.
It's certainly possible.
Kenny, that's an interesting red flag that staff should really take into account when looking at this, that the payroll growth assumption and amortization period, there's a feedback loop there, and that high payroll growth assumption likely means that amortization period is understated. And so we should just make sure we take that into account.
I agree. I think you've raised a good point, and one that we need to give more thought to.
Keith, say again what you said about local government.
Well, on a national basis, payrolls for state and local government have been growing actually a little bit below 2% over the last, since the Great Recession.
Do you have that figure for Texas?
No, I don't have it for Texas, but given some of what's happened in the Texas economy in recent years, I doubt that we're too much above that 2%.
I know TMRS has payroll growth rate of of 3.5%. Well, that's awful scary.
Well, it could be, and of course, it's a forward-looking figure, and we're coming out of a recession, so it may not be unrealistic, but it seems like 4 and 5% might be on the high side.
I guess I'm not quite seeing the correlation that you guys are seeing in this chart. I mean, the three plans on this chart that have the infinite amortization period all have payroll growth at 3 to 3.5%. You can, I mean, it kind of seems like the majority of the plans that have the payroll growth rate at the 4 to 5% are in the middle of the chart and not at the top end.
Yeah, I would agree that the correlation is not super close to 1, but it's not, it's definitely exists. You know, if you go towards the bottom of the chart, you see a lot fewer. So I agree that it's not super strong. I guess I don't know that the correlation is the interesting part of this. I think that the self-reinforcing nature of high payroll growth assumption and amortization period is something that we should pay attention to, less than the correlation between the two.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
On this page, I said TMRS was 3.5, but the county district is 3.5. TMRS is 3%.
Yeah.
Anything else on this tab 2?
Question about the process for developing this going forward. I love the pretty fall colors. Are we going to, what's the process going to look like for kind of updating this spreadsheet in particular going forward? Is that going to be something that's handled at the actuarial committee with staff? How are we going to continue to develop what is a draft of this?
Well, the next step, I believe, is to have a continued discussion at the next actuarial committee meeting. So I don't know. We were instructed to, so we had provided one without color coding for the committee meeting, and we were asked to include that to highlight the plans a little bit more easily. And so where this goes from here, I think, is probably up to the actuarial committee meeting, or actuarial committee.
Yeah, well, as a member of the actuarial committee, I think our thinking was that we would bring this first pass to the full board and get their feedback on it, and we'll come back for further refinements as the actuarial committee.
So understanding that all of not all of funding valuation metrics being the same, but that there's no one that is, I guess, more important than the other. How was the decision made to sort the table by amortization period as opposed to one of the other metrics?
This was the general view that I felt that the board is used to seeing, given that the actual evaluation report is sorted in this manner. And so since we are not assigning any particular weighting to a specific metric, we thought it would be helpful to just maintain that particular order.
Texas is a little peculiar in having quite a statutory focus on amortization period. Most other states don't focus as much on amortization period, but we do, and it's not necessarily better or worse, but it is different, and I think that it's been the convention of the PRB to present a lot of ranking information in terms of its the amortization period.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. How do you present this information? How do you rank order it is something that warrants further discussion. If you're going to combine the information, how would you combine it? I know that Mr. Brainerd has been thinking about that as well. On amortization period, I like that Texas is focused on amortization period because it captures elements of both funded ratio and funding effort. And so it captures two of the most important in kind of one metric, even though it's not perfect, but it seems to be better to me than any other single metric for rank ordering.
Certainly the actuarial committee can discuss this further. I do note that we've been doing it this way a long time. That doesn't mean we should continue doing it a long time, but it's something it has been looked at a lot in the past.
If I remember correctly, in the actuarial committee, we talked about future refinements as being possibly coming up with an index or some sort of weighting of these different factors.
Yeah, I would also encourage the committee to also take a very good look at the discount rate. Because if you look at the chart, most of the funds that have problems tend to have very high discount rate. And I don't think that is really realistic in today's market or what they've done in the past. So looking at the discount rate would be a very important aspect of this whole process.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. Just as payroll growth assumption is going to be, high payroll growth assumption is going to lead to an understatement, a likely understatement of the amortization period. So too will an overstatement of the discount rate.
And members, just to quickly add from staff's perspective, we are using the spreadsheet and the final version as the actuarial committee works on it to prioritize the plans that we want to start reviewing. And in the first review cycle, we have selected 3 plans. Once we are done with our review of those 3 and update the committee as well as the full board, we will make a determination of the next set of plans that we will select and start reviewing. We have already informed the 3 plans that Kenny just mentioned about the in-depth review, that it's part of our mandate, and the hope here is to have the conversation going both with the plan as well as the plan sponsor, and also solicit their input in our in-depth review to further identify issues that they may be facing on their end as far as funding the plan is concerned.
Thank you. Can you please restate the 3 plans that we're going to take a closer look at, and also let the committee know, the board know, how long a cycle is?
Certainly, we're looking at Greenville Fire, Marshall Fire, and Galveston Police. And as we are working on our first draft for these plans, the expectation is that we will have a draft available for the actuarial committee meeting in January. But it is there is no template for us to follow for this. We haven't done this at this level before, so we are trying to identify potential concerns as we go as well.
Thank you.
And our goal, just to quickly add here, members, is to see if we can go through the review cycle and spend maybe 3 months, since we'll be reviewing 2 to 3 plans at a time. So set aside 3 months for every review cycle and follow the process. Of course, we'll inform the committee before we make a determination, and then come back with our preliminary draft to the committees, consider recommendations and input from the committee actuarial committee members, incorporate those changes, and then go to the full board with our recommendations.
Thank you.
Anything else on this point?
I just have one last question. So what we're looking at actually is just the results of the various investments that have been made. So do we have the ability to look at those investments?
We feel confident that we now have the ability, given we've hired an investment analyst. So I'll be introducing our investment analyst who just started today, but that was an area of expertise we had not worked on, and now with an investment analyst on staff, that is certainly an area we'll be paying closer attention to.
All right, thank you very much. That'd be good.
Isn't that the first time we've had somebody in that position?
We did have an investment analyst back in 2010, 2011. However, when we lost that position, we didn't have the ability or the budget to fill that position again.
All right, talking about, moving on to item 4B, tab 2, to be, Kenny, you want to talk about, I'm sorry, it's C, talking about Houston.
Sure. So behind tab 2C, we have copies of the initial risk-sharing valuation studies performed by the 3 Houston pension plans in accordance with Senate Bill 2190 that was just passed. The purpose of these initial risk-sharing evaluation studies was to produce a corridor, a midpoint contribution requirement, as well as the corridor for the contribution, the City of Houston contributions to fall in over the next 30 years. There are a variety of requirements associated with how those contributions were determined, and then what will happen in the future should the plans fall outside the corridor or certain lines within the corridor. I'm not going to get into those today, but suffice it to say that all three plans have developed the corridors, and our responsibility with respect to these was to review and, as we typically would for an actual evaluation, but also make sure that they comply with the requirements of SB 2190. So we've gone through that process. We've included each of these in our updated actual evaluation report. And these are this was a July 1, 2016 valuation that set the contribution requirement beginning July 1, 2017. So going forward, they will be, the contributions that they're calculating is for the fiscal year starting 1 year after the valuation date. I'd also like to point out that the bond measure for the pension obligation bonds in Houston passed recently, so there are no concerns with potential clawbacks on benefits and that causing any issues with respect to moving forward with SB 2190. We are...
Kenny? Excuse me. All three of these valuations were based on a 7% discount rate?
They were all based on a 7% discount rate, yes. That was specified in the legislation as a requirement.
Thank you.
So all three, as I said, have finished HMEPS and, Houston Municipal Employees Pension System and I'm sorry, the actual names are escaping me at the moment. The police system and the muni system are, the actuaries did agree on substantial all of the assumptions, and their contributions were within 2% of one another, which means that the corridor is set by the pension system's valuation. If the system actuary and the city actuary do not, their projected contributions are not within 2% of one another, and they cannot come to an agreement that on assumption changes that bring them within 2%, then the required contribution is an arithmetic average of the two contributions. So if you look at the very last page of the first set, right before the first blue page, that shows you an addendum to the risk-sharing evaluation for Houston Fire, and it shows what the estimated contribution was as calculated by the fund, the estimated contribution by the city, and then the average of the two is going to be their actual midpoint, and the corridor is 5% above and below that rate. So it is, I thought it was interesting to note that the result of that average was about 32. Houston Police was also about 32%, and then Houston Muni, when taking into account their the legacy liability amortization, fell around 28% as their midpoint.
Do we know of any thoughts at this point about further discussion at the legislature about Houston?
I'm not aware of any potential discussion at the legislature. One thing with respect to Houston Fire is that the primary reason that Houston Fire's valuations differ so much were a couple of assumptions. The mortality assumption was different, as well as there was a 25 basis point difference in the assumed COLA in the long term, and so that had a significant impact on the total liabilities as well as the expected contribution requirements. However, there is an experience study requirement to be completed no later than September 30, 2020, and that is also a collaborative process where the system actuary and the city actuary will both be looking at those and discussing the assumptions that the experience study produces, and so their evaluations should ultimately should merge to the same where we'd be using the system. So within the next few years, I wouldn't expect to see this type of this calculation being done. And I think that's all that I have in my notes, so if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
So if I heard right, the municipal plan and the police officer's plan, they were within 2%. If I'm reading this right, the city and the firefighter's plan was off by 10%?
Yes.
Okay. And that, you said that was driven largely by mortality assumptions and by...
the cost of living
adjustment assumptions going forward. Okay. But this new arithmetic average is the midpoint for the corridor.
That's correct.
Okay. Another thing that might be useful, just to get clarification on, you mentioned that for the muni plan, the midpoint for the corridor that's included here is around 8.5 to 8.75%. However, the muni law was a little bit different. That might look a little odd when compared to 31, 32% for the other two plans. Muni law was a little different in that it peeled out the dollar amount for the initial unfunded liability and put that on a dollar level schedule. So that's not included in the corridor calculation, but it is kind of solid and unmovable in terms of the contribution rate. Do we know, you said the contribution rate for, all-in contribution rate for muni is?
It was about 28%.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments? Let's go to tab 2D, actuarial evaluation report. Kenny, lead us on that.
Sure. So as we have done for the last couple of board meetings, we have a summary of key statistics first, followed by the detail. I will say that since the August board meeting, that we have 17 new reports that have been included in this. So it updates the numbers some and shifts them. Obviously, we don't compare to what it looked like at the last board meeting, but what we are seeing is that there is a continued small uptick in the unfunded accrued liability and a slight decrease in the funded ratio. But we are seeing the discount rates decrease a little bit. I don't have it in front of me, but I think the mean at the last board meeting was probably closer to 7.55 versus the 7.51 that we have now, and the median was also, I think, 7.7 or 7.75. So we're seeing a small decrease as those go. If you'll direct your attention to the detail, I do want to point out we had mentioned that Dallas ERF Employees Retirement Fund was listed as infinite in August, but we had not had an opportunity to review the most recent valuation that they'd provided, which did put them at a finite number. Odessa Fire has also been infinite at the last board meeting, and their most recent valuation had been updated to put them at a finite number. A couple of other items that have happened since August that are probably worth noting. Employees Retirement System of Texas had a board meeting, I believe, in September, where they determined that they would lower their discount rate to 7.5%. It's not included in this because we don't have a valuation reflecting that just yet. I do expect to receive that before the end of the year. And they have projected possibly an infinite amortization period associated with lowering their discount rate to 7.5%. University Park, we heard about them in the legislative update in August. They have completed the process to close their retirement plan to new entrants and are shifting all new entrants to Texas Municipal Retirement System. I believe it was effective November 1st. I think that's pretty much everything that I have I wanted to point out as far as this is concerned. I'd be happy to answer any additional questions.
I'll ask again, is there anybody here from the San Antonio Police and Fire Retirement System? Please stand up, sir. Can you introduce yourself?
I'm Jim Smith. I'm an active trustee on the police side.
Great. Please let them know that at least this board member, and I suspect that all of the board, appreciates the efforts that you are making. Your actuarial numbers are really impressive. The low amortization period, the high funding level, the very conservative assumptions, I think speak very well of the system and its governance.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
I agree. going back to ERS, what are the implications going forward for them? So lowering the discount rate is a positive thing. It acknowledges that they've kind of undershot investment performance, assumed investment performance over a number of years. It increases their amortization period to infinite, will necessitate increased contributions into that plan. So can you walk me through what the future implications are in terms of process for ERS going forward?
So typically, they review their actuarial assumptions, specifically their investment return assumption, once every 4 years. They have decided to take another look at the investment return assumption 2 years from now. So there is some potential additional lowering of the investment return assumption in 2 years if they have not continued to meet this. As far as the process for potential contribution changes or benefit changes, I guess I'm not sure how well I can speak to that, but other than it being a legislative process that clearly with the lowering of the discount rate, the increase in the amortization period, they're going to continue to get a closer look, I think, than they might have otherwise.
Mr. Chairman, I may have misunderstood you, but I don't think that the fact that ERS has lowered their return assumption is necessarily an indication that they have underperformed investment-wise. I just think that they've revised the future projections of likely expected returns. And really, the lion's share of the ERS funding problems lie with the legislature and its chronic failure to pay anything close to required contributions over a sustained period of time.
Yeah, I think that just to clarify, you're right, Mr. Renner, that they've underperformed their assumption in the recent 10-year period, 5-year period, and so it's an indication that go-forward returns are likely to be lower, and that would necessitate higher contributions from the state. I share your concern that the state generally has not put enough money into the ERS system. I am concerned that changing assumptions, and it will of course necessitate costs, that we've been too slow to do that over time, and that has put ERS at a deficit. And so I'm glad to see that we are moving in the right direction, and that this will require the state to consider additional contributions and aligning benefits costs with the actual contributions going into the plan. I worry a little bit that we'll try to avoid having that tough conversation sooner rather than later. And there's an additional complication of the constitutional cap on state contributions to this plan. And so this is not going to be an easy issue to sort out. We have not paid enough attention to it in the past, and I'm anxious to have that conversation begin now instead of letting it wait until we're close to session and something has to happen.
I would note that I sat in on their meeting along with Kenny, and the actuary gave information about an actuarial assumption of 7%, excuse me. So, and they had a lot of discussion about that, and 1 or 2 board members agreed with that. But the majority of the board received a lot of calls and letters saying, go slow, don't move too fast, and so that's why they ended up at 7.5 instead of something lower like 7. So there's an awareness of that, of a potential need to move in that direction. Still too early to know what they'll do next time.
I kind of second and put a finer point on what you just said. My understanding is the actuary recommended going lower. The board chose not to go as low as the actuary recommended.
I think that's probably
and I don't think this is a clear indication, but I question a little bit. There was some discussion about contribution levels and the ability to get higher contributions from the state, and I question a little bit the board's discussion of that, given their fiduciary responsibility is to make sure benefits are funded. So I think that more scrutiny of that is definitely necessary. I think a lot of scrutiny of the adequacy of contributions and how we're going to get to adequate contributions is where this discussion needs to shift pretty quickly.
Yeah, I just have one question for you. So lowering of the discount rate or increasing it, is it, just from the discussions we're having, is it a good thing or a bad thing in relation to ERS?
I wouldn't say that it's a good thing or a bad thing. The process that should be followed is the appropriate risk level for a plan is decided. So you set your what your asset allocation is going to be, and based on that, the actuary takes that information and determines what is a reasonable assumed rate of return for the long term. And so in this case, ERS did happen to change their asset allocation, and then along with that, they looked at what the appropriate assumed rate of return was going to be, and I believe 7 to 7.5% was probably the recommended as what was a reasonable range for their new asset allocation.
So,
Do we know any more about TRS, Teacher Retirement System, whether they are talking about moving to their interest rate? I believe it's at 8%.
I believe they are in the process of performing an experience study and are looking at that probably, I think they're supposed to be looking at the experience study this spring, and then potentially discussing changes for 2018 evaluation.
Good.
I would just add on the discount rate discussion, Kenny was being diplomatic and was talking about process. I think given where some of these discount rates are, that 8%, the way to put that is that's just very risky from a contribution standpoint. Using that higher rate to discount means that you are very likely understating the contributions that will be necessary to cover benefits costs. And so coming down from a number that high is positive from a contribution standpoint. Now you could worry once you get that there's a point at which you get too low, but anytime you lower the discount rate, you're putting more money into the fund, you're lowering the contribution risk in the future. And I think that from the current levels, we can say that lowering is good. It takes contribution risk off the table.
Sure. I agree.
Anything else on this item? If not, Anu, you're going to talk about the dashboard.
Thank you, Bob. Members, behind tab 2E, we have included a brief outline of the draft website design that staff has come up with. Given the appropriated budget for developing the dashboard, we couldn't get all the interactive features that we wanted. So staff put a lot of thought into what our constituents most need, what other research organizations are offering as far as pension data online, and we researched the technical assistance requests that we receive on an ongoing basis and identified that majority of the requests we receive are for comparative plan data. So keeping those aspects in mind, we held some design sessions, and as a preliminary draft, we came up with 3 main sections for our online pension dashboard. The one section would include individual plan data, including some governance information on the plan, as well as trend information on the actuarial side, investment side, financial side, and wherever possible, we would also include some comparative metric or comparative information for individual data points from the peer group for that particular plan. For example, if we provide when we provide ERS data and a 10-year trend in their funded ratio, we will also include an aggregate of the peer group for ERS, which would be the statewide system, so our constituents can have some comparative data points on the individual plan section side. We will also include a comparative plan section where in each of those data points, actuarial, financial, investments, again, we will include as much as possible comparative data for each peer group that we would identify. And then the third section would include the raw data for the information or the data sets that we house on the dashboard. And I wanted to make sure I give members a heads up on that, and if you have any input, thoughts on additional information that the dashboard should include, please let us know.
So I got a question on the dashboard. Is it the new website, is it going to be open to the general public, or is there going to be a section that is only available to members just because of, exposure to competitive data, information, privacy issues?
Sure. We will not include any individual identifiable plan member information on the dashboard. The reports, the information that we receive from our retirement systems are public information as a state agency. Any information that we house, for the most part, is public. So the information that we will provide on the dashboard is already available if someone were to request that of us. And the dashboard would be an open portal accessible to all our constituents, including retirement systems and the legislature.
All right, thank you.
Anything else on this point?
If I missed it, when will the online dashboard be completed? When do we expect that to be done?
So we have just started the process. We have started looking at the different queries that we will need. We'll query our internal database to come up with the data sets. We hope to have the dashboard ready before next session so we can update the legislature, given they had appropriated us the money. So our goal would be definitely to have the dashboard done before next session.
Got it.
All right, let's move now to 4F, Public Retirement Systems Report and Compliance, including the following items. Reese, would you talk to us about this?
Sure. Good morning, members. I'm Reese Freeman, Financial Analyst at the Pension Review Board. Behind tab 2F, you'll find the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan report. Since it's fairly similar to the report that was presented at the last board meeting in August, I'm just going to go over the updates, but feel free to ask any questions along the way. As you can see, Dallas Police and Fire's combined plan has been added to the progress report. In August, staff discussed the changes to the system's retirement plan made by HB 3158. The bill went into effect on September 1st, and we will continue to monitor Dallas Police and Fire status through this report. Additionally, on the progress report, we have updated 2 other plans after receiving new valuations. Odessa Fire's amortization period decreased from 48.6 years to 46.5 years as of its 2017 AV. The fund is currently on target to have an end period of less than 40 years by the 2026 goal year. Orange Fire's amortization period increased from 47.4 years to 69.3 years as of its 2017 valuation. This increase requires the fund to submit a new FSRP due to it not being in compliance with their original restoration plan. A letter was sent to the fund at the beginning of October informing them of this new FSRP requirement due in February 2018. All right, on the next page, we have the systems immediately subject to FSRP formulation requirement list. That's quite a title. Marshall Fire has been placed on this list because its 2016 AV has a fund with an amortization period of 56.4 years, increasing from 43.2 years in 2014. For plans with valuations performed every other year, statute requires an FSRP after just 2 consecutive valuations with end periods greater than 40 years. If there are no questions?
I have a question.
Yep.
I have a question related to the Dallas Employees Retirement Fund. Do we know why they had the change in that amortization period?
Are you asking what caused it to go down? So they went from, they had 2 years at Infinite, and they are now at 47.
Okay, I'm sorry. I was reading the schedule backwards.
It's covered.
But just to quickly note, they did add a new tier, a new cheaper tier to their plan,
Benefits.
which was voted by the voters last November.
Sure, yeah, no, I literally was reading it backwards, so I was wondering why with all the recent changes that they made.
Got it.
I have a question,
What we're
please.
talking about is the muni plan. aren't we?
Yes.
And that's different than the police and fire plan.
I have a question about the police and fire plan.
Sure.
So they're on the list. And does this valuation reflect the reforms that were just have been enacted?
Yes, it does.
So all of those reforms, and they're still on the list?
Well, so this is, the first list is the progress report. So basically, it is a list of all the plans that have been subject to the FSRP requirement and submitted it in FSRP. And this is keeping track of where they stand now.
But the amortization period is not improved.
But those are the same, what we're showing here is the FSRP, the actual evaluation, the most recent AV, and we're showing in both columns, we happen to be showing both for Dallas Police and Fire.
So do we have a calculation for Dallas and Police and Fire that reflects the reforms?
That's what the 44 years is. This is the January 1, 2017 valuation that reflects all of the changes.
Just to be clear, they were Infinite before.
Yes.
And they are down to 44 years after what is appears to be kind of a step in the reforms that will be necessary to bring Dallas Police and Fire in alignment with the FSRP requirement.
Thank you.
Just a quick note on format. I think that Stephanie may have been reading it backwards because the years kind of flip on the two different tables, so you might just flip those. On the FSRP requirements, so you highlighted Orange Fire. That requires an update from them. When do we expect to receive an update from them on their new FSRP, since they are missing the mark on their current FSRP?
Yes, we sent them a letter in October, and the due date for that FSRP is February 2018.
By the way, welcome, Reese. Your first day and you're at a board meeting.
No.
Presenting.
He's presenting. First time presenting at a board meeting.
Yep.
Yes.
Been here for a few years.
Okay. So we expect them to comply with that letter soon?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll note that we haven't actually received a response to the letter, so we have not followed up to verify that they are working on an FSRP. We simply noted that their amortization period fell outside of their former plan, which forces them to, or requires that they formulate a new plan to get back to 40 years within 10 years from.
So let's not let this fall off the radar. Plans that are falling short on their FSRP plan are in real danger of spinning off into the abyss, and we just need to make sure that we stay on top of those plans.
Correct.
I just have a quick question. On the second page, systems immediately subject to FSRP formulation requirement in progress. Can you explain that in plain English a little bit? Just what does that mean?
These are the funds that need to provide us a funding soundness restoration plan, and they're working on providing it to us.
So do you have a deadline to do that?
Yes, they do.
The 6 months from the date that they adopt the actual evaluation that initiates this requirement is when they're required to formulate the plan, and then they have 30 days from that date to submit the plan to the PRB.
Okay, thank you.
All right, if there are no further questions, I'll move on to the next item, which is behind tab 2G, Public Retirement System Compliance and Reporting. As you can see in the first table, there are 43 more plans in compliance now than there were in August. Most of the retirement systems that became compliant since the last board meeting did a great job getting their compliance documents to us soon after the deadline. the second table, you'll notice that we have an additional plan that has been non-compliant for more than 60 days, and I'll go over that plan in just a moment. The third table shows the combined total net assets based on the most recent financial reports, and in the final table, you'll see the current and past board meeting and periods from our 2 most recent AV reports. All right, on the next page, past the divider, you'll see that we've added Midland Firemen's Relief and Retirement Fund to the 60-day non-compliance list. We have been in communication with the fund and expect to receive their final compliance document soon. Behind the next divider, we have an example of a letter informing a sponsoring entity of a planned 60-day non-compliance, one that was sent to Dallas County Hospital District this year. And behind the next divider, there's a letter informing the sponsor of the plan's return to compliance. This is sent out once we have received and reviewed all of the plan's compliance reports. All right, and finally, behind the next divider, we have a list of current total net assets for each retirement system. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Just one question. On the valuation of the net assets, what's the date as of the time of publication or from?
Which one exactly?
Well, I mean, the valuation, the net assets, as of what date? Is it last year end or?
These are from their most recent financial report, so it's as of the fiscal year, the most recent fiscal year end that has been reported to the PRB. So if you'll notice, the second column shows the report date, and so those are the dates that are specific to the...
Thank you.
Sorry.
Anything else on this? Next is Ashley Rindo to talk to us about the Northeastern Medical Center Hospital Retirement Plan.
Good morning, members. Ashley Rendon, the Pension Review Board. At the August meeting, the board made a motion to invite the Northeast Medical Hospital Center Retirement Plan and its board to this meeting. They unfortunately were not able to attend this meeting, but we, through that formal request, we were able to have communication with our board chair. And behind tab 2H, we have a copy of a letter that we received from their board chair, and he was informing us that they would be doing the audit for 2015 and 16. And behind the next divider, or the divider, is the letter of engagement that we have received from him as well. And they will be having the audit done through the same auditor who does the audit for the sponsor. And so this plan is due in the end of January every year, so we'll look to receiving their audit for 2015 and 16 soon, and then hopefully their 2017 audit soon after.
And members, since the plan has already started communicating with us and has acknowledged their non-compliant status, which they've not provided an annual report for the past 3 years, have already engaged an auditor to conduct the audit, we did not feel the necessity to drag them to the board meeting.
This is positive movement. They've been on this list for a while, huh?
That's correct.
Anything else, Ashley?
That's all we have.
Okay.
Those are my questions.
And I think, Mr. Chairman, we're up to item 5 on the agenda.
Fantastic. Thank you, staff. Thank you, Mr. May. We're going to move on to item number 5 on the agenda, an update on the initial meeting of the Advisory Committee on Principles of Retirement Plan Design. And I'll turn this over to Vice Chair Brainard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The so-called Pension Review Board Advisory Committee on Principles of Retirement Plan Design had its inaugural meeting last month. Members are Ms. Libby and Mr. Chairman McGee and myself. And we had a good discussion of what retirement plan designs ought to be. As a bit of background, the basis for forming this ad hoc committee was that we felt that since we are the Pension Review Board, perhaps we ought to be on record as being in support of some form of retirement plan design. What should a retirement plan be for employees of state and local government, rather than simply assuming that a retirement plan is in place and provided to these workers. And so we began that effort and had what I would call a robust conversation, hammered out the potential positions of the Pension Review Board in terms of what the principles of retirement plan design ought to be for employees of state and local government. And we categorized those into the categories that are listed behind tab 3 of the tab. 9 categories we've got at the moment. I won't read all of those, but we wanted to, this is a work and effort. I suspect that it will take a few meetings for us to get down to the final set of principles, but we wanted to bring these to you for your information, and in case either now or later you have any particular thoughts, concerns, questions that you'd like to share with us that you can incorporate at our next meeting. And I would give the other members, including Ms. Libby and Chairman McGee, an opportunity to elaborate on those comments.
That was great, and I think this effort is probably long overdue, in that the mandate of the PRB includes oversight of both the kind of benefits and funding of those benefits. We have goalposts in our guidelines for pension plan funding. We don't have any kind of goalposts on the benefit side, and so this kind of mirrors the guidelines for plan funding, and I think it's an interesting exercise. Again, would just stress this is a draft, that there will be multiple meetings. Would love any input from you all. We'll have public comment at some point, maybe multiple rounds of public comment on this, but I commend the members of the committee for being engaged in this, and the board being interested in taking it on.
Yeah, coming from me, I commend the board members, committee members, for coming up with these design draft. I'm just curious if some of the ideas, if you're aware, if we've been used in other plans in other parts of the country.
Is your question whether some of the principles that are articulated here in use elsewhere?
Yes.
Well, I will tell you that some of these, perhaps many of them, came from a resolution that is maintained by the National Association of State Retirement Administrators, which happens to be my employer, and that resolution articulates basically principles of retirement plan design.
Okay, well, that's good.
That served as a rough starting point for many of these elements.
And I'll just kind of have a little bit of my input sitting on the committee on a moving forward, and we can discuss this in more in depth at the next committee meeting. But one thing that I would like to do is kind of maybe take a step back and figure out who our target audience for these guidelines is, and what the ultimate goal of the guidelines should be. Because I think when we set those two parameters, that it'll help us get a better focus on some of these guidelines.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic recommendation. You know, for me, the audiences are the decision makers on the benefit side, and that varies depending on the plan structure. And I think for me, the goal is very similar to what we've done on the funding side, and just kind of setting some goalposts. Not saying there shouldn't be, if circumstances on the ground warrant it, that you shouldn't be outside the goalpost, but we're going to set up some goalposts that could be good targets. I also, you know, on this language, there are some elements here that probably should be more should consider instead of solid shoulds. And there are probably things that wording that we could clean up, or things that we've left out. So very much welcome feedback from other board members on this.
Question, are you looking at CalPERS, I believe the largest system in the United States, and do you see following anything they're doing? I'm not personally knowledgeable of what they're doing. I just know they're large and frequently discussed, and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, so CalPERS has been very kind of ahead of the curve in terms of risk modeling, considering the future, doing a lot on that front. They've been very forward-thinking in their consideration of investment allocation and whether they should be in alternatives quite so heavily, how much of that should be done in-house. They have now started to lead in terms of investment fees. I'm not aware of much they've done necessarily on kind of parameters or goals around benefit design, but if you have something that kind of speaks to that from CalPERS, I would love to see it. I think that they are, the CalPERS board and the CalPERS staff is now very switched on to some of these forward-looking issues and has been ahead of the curve in many ways.
That's all I have.
So we'll continue to meet, and I suspect we'll be back with perhaps more refined set of principles at coming meetings. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Fantastic. So we're moving on to item number 6 on the agenda. We're going to switch back to the Education and Research Committee to discuss and consider the minimum educational training program pursuant to Section 801.211 of the Texas Government Code. Judge Cable, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could call Christine Taylor. Thank you. How are you?
Good, how about you? If you look behind tab number 4, the first report I'm going to give to you today details the compliance with the MET reporting requirements. As a reminder, these numbers do not reflect the trustees and system administrators compliant with the training requirements, only that their systems have actually submitted to us their required reports. As the first chart indicates, there are currently 9 systems that are not compliant with the October 1st, 2017 deadline. One system actually did submit yesterday, so our number is down from 10. The number of non-compliant systems is up from 4 from our last meeting. We will be sending out the 60-day late notices in December. The majority of non-compliant systems typically submit training after this letter is sent to them. As you can see on the following page, we currently only have one system that has not reported any training since the October 1st, 2016 deadline. Okay, next, I will be updating you on the accredited sponsors and approval of and the approved course renewal process. Over the past several months, we've been working with our sponsors on a renewal of their sponsor accreditation. As of today, all 11 sponsors that were up for renewal in 2017 have renewed with us and will be accredited for the next 4 years. We also renewed one approved course for continuing education credits.
Mr. Chairman, could staff please provide the board with a list of those sponsors? Thank you.
Any further questions?
It sounds like the increase in the number of non-compliant systems is kind of the natural ebb and flow across the year, and so no reason for concern?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The reason why the last time it was so low is because it had been several months since the last meeting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, so that's it from the Education and Research Committee. So we're moving on right along to item number 7 on the agenda, Legislative Committee. We're going to discuss and consider a couple of items, so I'll turn it over to Mr. Massengale.
Chairman, would you allow me to call on Anu to bring this report?
Sure, thank you, Mr. Massengale. Members, to quickly refresh your memory, one of the board's mandates is to recommend policies, practices, and legislation. And with this agenda item, what staff is looking for is if members have any recommendations on topics that the staff could examine over the course of next year to essentially include in the board's biennial report for the legislature to consider as a best practice. We could, over the course of next year, examine those topics, work with the board, and formulate best practices around the areas that the board feels are advisable for the legislature to consider. So at this point, we are requesting members to provide any input or thoughts on those interim study topics that the staff could look at.
And how would that be provided to you, by email or by verbal, or what's the process?
If you have any thoughts now, we would appreciate that. If not, you could definitely reach out to us later after the meeting and let us know if there are any topics you'd like us to
An
look at.
email would be okay.
Email would be just fine.
Mr. Massengale, Anu, I've got one suggestion for possible interim study, and that regards the benefits and feasibility of the possible consolidation of smaller pension funds in the state.
Thank you. We will
Thank you.
include that.
I would also be interested in kind of diving a little bit more into funding policy and better understanding funding policies for our plans, given the high number of fixed rate plans. I think it would be very interesting to look into funding policy specifically for fixed rate plans and understand how that might play out over the next few years.
Thank you. We could add that to our list as well.
Yeah, one area I've been interested in is the investment policies. What type of investments are they making, and the distribution of those investments.
Thank you.
Can you tell me a little bit about timing for this? So you're collecting ideas now, you would then execute on those ideas with reports coming out?
Before November of next year. We are required to publish our biennial report in which we outline the activities of the board over the last 2 years, as well as include any board recommendations for the legislature to consider. That is a statutorily required report which we have to publish in November of every even-numbered year. So our goal would be to work on or examine these topics and put together a report to be published in our biennial report next year. And a quick note here, members, given the projects that we are currently working on, I should have quickly added that, we were hoping if we could limit these topics to no more than maybe 2 or 3 between the dashboard, the plan reviews, and we do expect both the House as well as the Senate to start holding their interim hearings next session on the pension-related charges. We expect to be busy over the course of next year, so staff would request if we could limit these topics to no more than 2 or 3, please.
So my question is, as you work to define what these topics should be, how closely should they align or not align with the current interim charges from the House and the Senate? Like, does it make sense to study the topics at the same time, or do you want to study two different topics so that you're bringing different information to the table?
That is a good question. I don't recall off the top of my head the interim charges, pension-related interim charges. However, we can certainly compare. For example, I do believe with investments, Senate State Affairs has a charge which is inclined towards investment best practices as well. So we could take that into consideration, and if that's the case, we would probably be providing information to the State Affairs Committee with regards to those best practices, and we could consider combining any recommendations that the board has with that particular interim charge. I don't quite recall the topics that Keith and Josh recommended here, if the interim charges relate to those topics or not, but we could look into it. And
Yeah, I think there is some overlap. So I think there's going to be a little bit of overlap. I think that having some extension on will be additive, and so I think that that's kind of the way to think about it.
Okay.
By when are you going to decide on the final topics, and what's our involvement in that decision?
We could send out an email, the three topics that were mentioned here. I could go back and research the investment-related topic, and if State Affairs is considering that, we could think about maybe merging those. But with the funding policy as well as the topic that Keith recommended, if members are good with those suggestions, we could start our work on those topics.
It's fine with me.
I heartily endorse my topic.
Yeah, I think you should just run with those topics. Since we only have 3 and you're saying 2 to 3, let's figure out how best to do it and make it happen. Unless you receive in the next few days some great email suggestions, then maybe we revisit.
That sounds
Well, I also heard my suggestion in light of the fact that you just hired an investment analyst. So I think you already have the resource to do that. But besides that, I think that what we've been seeing so far, results, we need to know what's driving those results, and that's where investment comes in.
Sure. And that's an aspect we would also be looking at in our in-depth reviews for sure. So we could look at some of the data that could potentially back up the topic, the investment-related topic. Yep.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you, members.
Great, so moving on to item number 8 on the agenda, we're going to review and discuss a report from the Executive Director on a number of matters. Anu?
Thank you, Josh. These items are updates to the board. The first item on here is an update on fiscal year 2018 operating budget. Members, behind tab 5, we have included a copy of our updated operating budget as of October, and I just wanted to let the members know that we are in line with the budget that was approved by the board at the beginning of this fiscal year. And if the members don't have any questions, I'll move on to the next item, which is an update on the TELFRA annual conference. The TELFRA conference was held on October 2nd and 3rd of last month, and staff attended as well as presented at the annual conference. Kenny, our staff actuary, taught a course on risk management, which is one of the core topics of our MET program. The turnout at the conference was good. 106 trustees from 30 TELFRA systems attended the conference. And that's all I had.
Could you just update in case somebody in the room doesn't know what TELFRA, who's...
Texas Local Firefighters Retirement Act. That's the umbrella statute under which 42 different firefighter plans are organized. Thank you, members. Moving on, we wanted to provide a quick update on the 2017 evaluation of PRB educational services. We conducted this survey partly because of our performance measure requirement, where we are required to solicit input from our constituents on the quality of the educational services that the agency provides, and based on those input, work on improving those services if required. We sent out the survey to 732 participants, which included plan administrators, trustees, as well as our government contacts. The response rate was close to 10%. We received 75 responses, and the overall satisfaction rate was close to 96%. And if there were a couple of suggestions that were included in the survey responses, and we'll make sure that we review those and make necessary changes if required. Moving forward, the last item is I wanted to let the members know we have 2 new staff who I would like to introduce to the board. We hired Eusebio Arispe, and he goes by Chevo, 2 months ago. And Chevo, thank you, Chevo, has a bachelor's in accounting from Texas A&M, and he's assisting our accountant, Wes, with the accounting duties. And he's a great addition to the team. And then we also hired Mark Seitel as our investment analyst. Mark has a master's in finance from University of Houston in Victoria, and is a CFA Level 2 exam candidate. So including our 2 new hires members, we are now staffed at 12 employees. We are authorized for 14, but given our limited budget, we do not expect to fill the remaining 2 positions. And we are very excited to have both Chevo and Mark. And today is Mark's first day, and he's attending a board meeting.
Welcome. We're glad you're here.
Yes.
Yeah, most definitely.
That concludes my report, members.
Didn't you attend a lawyers' meeting, of state lawyers? That's not the right term, but there was a meeting.
We attended the Attorney General's Law and Liability Conference.
Yeah, I
Yes.
just wondered, is there anything?
We did not include that on the agenda.
Okay.
I wasn't at that
When I did it, I had the same reaction.
Great. All right, so moving right along, we are going to agenda item number 9, call for future PRB agenda items. Does anybody on the board have an item they would like to add to our next board meeting's agenda? Seeing none, the date and location of the next PRB meeting is very unsatisfying, but it's TBD. We'll figure it out. It's going to be in January sometime. Is that correct?
We expect to have our actuarial and advisory committee meeting in January.
And-
We will be polling the members soon for the board meeting dates for next year.
Okay.
And we expect to have a early or mid-March board meeting.
Got it. So committee meeting and work group meeting will be in January, and we'll probably meet as a board in March. So it's going to be a little while before we see each other. Great. Any other comments on future dates? Seeing none, like to invite public comment now. If there's anybody who would like to make a comment, please make your way up to the podium and make a comment. Please state your name and affiliation.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay. My name is David Keller, Chair of the Houston Firefighters Relief and Retirement Fund. First, I'd like to thank Chairman McGee and Vice Chairman Brainerd for all the work that's gone into this, and the staff, I knew, and Kenny, and we've been in contact as we work through the adjustments. I want to thank you guys for working through the adjustments with us. Not only work, but the thought that goes into all these things. It takes a lot of work and thought to make this major an adjustment. So Senate Bill 2190 requires an averaging process, and we talked about that earlier today. When the system calculates one city contribution and the city calculates a different city contribution, it required an averaging process. This averaging process could lead to, it's actually systematic underfunding of the plan in the traditional sense, where I guess where the back half of that is the corridor is there as the hammer. If you don't have excess return, there'll be additional adjustments to the plan. And so I don't know that we've had a lot of conversation about that, but with the averaging process, you're going to have requirements to have excess return or additional adjustments to the plan, either through increased contributions or lower benefits. And then, so I'm kind of throwing these things out there, and then we can discuss them, or where you guys can ask questions. I'll be here for that. The last thing is, as we've been working through to comply with the law, we still have an open question as to the constitutionality of some portions of it, and that's still being litigated on our ability to set the assumptions, like every other system in the state, except for the Houston systems. We have a limitation on our assumption setting, and that's still being litigated. It is in the appellate court. The city has a response due to the appellate court by January 3rd, and then the process will move forward from there. So just want to put that, make you guys aware of that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Keller, and I appreciate your engagement in this entire process. Quickly looking at, and I acknowledge the kind of averaging issue that you raised, and we've got members in your packet, and I don't have no clue where it was at this point because I ripped it out. We've got for the Houston Fire plan, we've got kind of the estimates from the city, estimates from the plan, and then the average. The city and the plan and their estimates for the midpoint of cost were about 10 percentage points off. They averaged them. Of course, that's going to land right in the middle. I would note that because you were about 10% off and the corridor goes up +5, that the top of the corridor, your contribution rate is still, the contribution rate the plan estimated is still within the corridor and would not necessitate plan cuts. So I think it's fair to say that that averaging process, because you and the city were so far off, that the average is below, the midpoint is below where you guys, the plan estimated it, but I would note that your estimate is still within the corridor.
That's right. And the other part of the process, and you guys had a little bit of conversation, there will be a third party involved in the experience study that was not involved in the initial RSVS process. That could lead to some help in getting the next time we won't be so far apart. So
that would be great. One additional point on the assumption setting, I would put it just a little bit different. That is probably no surprise to you that I would put it a little bit different Absolutely. Than you would. I think that the plan can still do its assumptions the way it does it. What's restricted here is funding policy, and those are different things that are separable. In the past, a lot of plans have matched those together, but by my reading, the law sets funding policy, and the plan can continue to report an ADC based on assumptions and say, look, we're continuing to be underfunded. I think that I expect that you will probably do that over time. You will use your own assumptions and report that, and I think that's totally allowable under the law.
It does separate some functions that make it a little tricky, though.
So, Mr. Keller, two things. Can you please provide the board with just a very brief explanation, not here, but afterward, a very brief explanation of the reasons that there are different outcomes of the contribution rates?
Sure, and I can give you two quick pieces, and then we can go in more depth. But the first one would be the mortality assumption. When you're projecting a mortality for out 30 years, you really do have to use a conservative mortality table, knowing that people are living longer and health is improving. And the other piece, I believe, was, just escaped me what the other piece was. There was two major pieces.
I believe it was the COLA.
The cost of living, we're correct. So we assumed that the cost of living would be at one level, and the city assumed another. They chose a more conservative cost of living.
Can you please provide that information with the detail you're providing?
Sure.
Along with the actuarial consultants that are supporting each one?
Okay.
And secondly, can you clarify the lawsuit you're referring to? Is that the pension plans that are suing?
Just the firefighter plan is suing.
And you're challenging the constitutionality of the state setting the discount rate?
Well, a number of the assumptions, yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes, sir, thank you.
And my understanding, just to clarify, my understanding, that suit has already made its way through a couple of court proceedings.
Just one?
Just one court proceeding, and it's being appealed at this point.
It's at the appellate
And the first court proceeding, that did not go in favor of the plan.
That's right.
Okay. Great. And on, whenever you provide that summary, it would be great to know kind of the specifics. I think knowing kind of the actuarial, the mortality table that the plan used versus the mortality table that the city used, and then the exact difference in the assumed COLA rate would be fantastic, just to kind of be able to see those.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Members, we can work with the plan and make sure we provide that information to you.
Yeah, any other public comment? All right, seeing none, we're going to move on to our last item, which is everybody's favorite, the adjournment. So if there's no further business and no objection, the chair moves to adjourn this meeting.
Second.
We are adjourned.